Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for coming to this afternoon workshop, really. And this is, of course, a workshop on how to find real success and transform the world through King Yoga. And King Yoga is a new yoga, which was recently introduced by the Aetherius Society this year. And we've already given lectures and classes around the world, Nigeria, Canada, America, England, New Zealand. And it's quite an exciting year. But this is the first time where both executive secretaries from the American and European headquarters will be on the same stage at the same time to explain a little more about King Yoga. So if you don't know me, my name is Keneipp. I'm the executive secretary of the American headquarters, and I'm very happy to welcome my good friends, Dr. Richard Lawrence, who is the executive secretary of the European headquarters, and his wife, Alison Lawrence, also from London, who is the international director of the Aetherius Society. Richard is especially qualified, I think, to speak about King Yoga, as he was a very close disciple and friend of the founder of the Aetherius Society, Dr. George King. He was also the author of, or co-authored, 2 books with Dr. King. Most importantly for today, he co-authored the last book by our master entitled Realize Your Inner Potential. Some of those practices we will be discussing and practicing, because there's a workshop today. And I'd like to please ask you all to give a very warm welcome to Richard and Alison Lawrence.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon, I must say. Really is fantastic to be back here. Personally, I've spent years of my life here in the past, especially when Dr. King was physically with us. He's still very much with us, of course. And we're really, Alice and I are thrilled to be with you this afternoon. And in terms of King Yoga, what happened was basically this, is that the book that Brian mentioned, Realize Your Inner Potential, when Dr. King was with us, and it's very much, I want to stress this, his book. I was privileged to help him, but it's totally his book, of course. And we published an edition of this just after his passing. It was published posthumously. And this one came out in 1998. And then that sold out, that edition, and we did another edition. And then that sold out. These are good problems to have. And so we were going to do a 3rd edition. And in doing the 3rd edition, we I had the idea anyway, that it should be re-subtitled with the subtitle of King Yoga as the path of selfless service, around very much the master, at the source of all the teachings and practices in it. And that was agreed by the directors. And before I go any further, I want to take this as been my first opportunity to thank someone who was actually instrumental in both the books that I co-authored with our master, and that is Rodney Crosby. Because Rodney Rodney designed and did the layout for the 1st edition of Realize Your Inner Potential. And then last year, he was responsible for the layout and the publication of the 3rd edition. And he also, being a professional and an expert in the field of publishing and printing and design, he got us a much cheaper price than we would normally have got, saved the Society a lot of money. As well as that, he actually designed the first book, Contacts with the Gods from Space, and arranged the printing of the 2 editions of that. This is the first chance I've had, believe it or not, to actually thank Rodney in public. Thank you very much, Rodney. Anyway, so that came out last year with the King Yoga title, and Brian immediately, I think, latched on and realized and stated that, in fact, King Yoga, of course, is more than what's contained in that book. King Yoga is everything that Dr. King left us. And we had many discussions, Brian and I, about that. And then we spoke to all the international directors, and it was agreed universally, and many others have welcomed it, which is fantastic. And I want to explain really what it is and what it isn't. First of all, King Yoga does not replace the Aetherius Society in any respect at all. The Aetherius Society is, of course, the organization which practices and performs King Yoga. The aims and objects of the society stand, they will always stand. That's completely unaltered. What it does do, though, is bring the focus of the path that we practice, the teachings, the missions, the practices, to the source of them all. Because everything in King Yoga, every teaching, every practice, every mission, either came directly from Dr. George King, from his own brilliant mind, or it came through him from a being, a cosmic or an ascended master. Or it's some knowledge that he had acquired in his many years as a yogi and training as a yogi, and I'll say a bit about that in a moment. Knowledge that he'd acquired and then distilled and put his own unique stamp upon. So, for example, there might be a breathing exercise which is thousands of years old that he knew well and decided to use, but he might add to that an affirmation of his own device, which has never been used with it before. So it all has his own stamp, whether it's from him, whether it's through him, or whether it's knowledge that he gained in his many years. And just talking about that, for those of you who aren't so familiar with Dr. King, I think nearly all of you are, he was born, of course, in England. And I'm not going to go into his life story, because that's a fascinating thing in itself. That's work in progress. We're working intensively on the biography of Dr. King, and that's one of the main reasons I'm here, actually, to speak to people, especially his dear wife and Irene and others who really, really did know him for that purpose. But he was born in England, and he was already a completely unique individual. He already had distinctive characteristics. Just for example, he knew as a child, as a very, very young child, how to pray correctly. He wasn't taught how to pray correctly in the church that he attended, because it wasn't known. What we in the society do, which many of you practice, called dynamic prayer, he just knew as a child. And now thousands of people practice this around the world. He was aware, even as a child, of the illumination which comes virtually as lights in the head, it can be perceived as, from the higher chakras. He lived with that. And then throughout his childhood, he developed his spiritual leaning. He was a very practical person always, by the way. Very, very grounded person, amazingly enough, but still developed his spiritual leaning, went through the war, the Second World War, as a conscientious objector, but very active in it, in a very dangerous field, in the fire service, in the London Blitz. So not avoiding the danger, but just being a conscientious objector. But after the war, he did something really unusual then. It wouldn't be that unusual now, but he turned to yoga, which very few people did in those days. But he didn't just turn to yoga, he turned to it very, very intensively for 10 years. And cutting a long story short, he went through numerous practices for 8 hours a day. That's unique, as well as doing a job. I've never heard of anyone else yet who's done that in the West. And in the East, they probably wouldn't have a job. They probably have and that's no offense, by the way, but they probably take a sannyasin's path, is what I meant by that. And a begging bowl, maybe. But he worked, he practiced, and then he attained samadhi, enlightenment, whatever you call it. That's before he founded the Aetherius Society at all. And I would say myself that he was so humble that he wouldn't devise a path round his own name. But I do believe he would absolutely welcome it. And just to be clear what King Yoga is in its broadest sense, why not call it, say, Karma Yoga if it's a path of service? First of all, King Yoga includes not just Karma Yoga. That's the first point. It would be actually incorrect to call it Karma Yoga on its own, because it includes Jnana Yoga, the yoga of wisdom, very, very much so. It includes Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion. You could actually say that calling it King Yoga is a Bhakti act. It's an act of devotion, in a sense. It very much includes Raja Yoga, elements, not the dangerous ones, but elements of Kundalini Yoga, of Kriya Yoga. So it's bigger than that. But there's something else that I have always found, and this could be a bit of a confession, what I'm going to say now. And I don't know whether any of you have found this as well. But I've studied works on Karma Yoga from time to time by teachers who I really, really respect, because there's one great thing about the Aetherius Society, and that is that we don't say we're a one and only way. We don't say don't look at anything else. Or some religions have a kind of a fear of looking at anything else. Not at all. We say examine truth wherever you find it. And for those of us who've taken this path, we've never found anything to match it. That's a different thing. But it's not a one and only way. We've never said that. So I have looked at a number of works on Karma Yoga and ancient Vedic texts too, I have to say. And I've always finished them, and this is by great yogis in certain cases. I won't actually name because it would be, I think, disrespectful in view of what I'm going to say. When I've finished looking at them, I've always felt a little bit disappointed. That's just being honest. And I didn't really know why. And then, of course, it dawned on me, it's obvious why. It's because having had such close proximity to Dr. King and his totally unique stamp on karma, and his very different approach to world service. There's nothing really, you can't compare it, for example, to an ancient work on Karma Yoga. In the past, Karma Yoga was generally regarded as a lowly thing. It was regarded as a path for a person who wasn't ready for something higher. It wasn't something like King Yoga where we do Jnana Yoga, advanced Jnana Yoga, I would say, for those who are ready. We do practice elements of Raja Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, as I mentioned, and Mudra, and Mantra, and so on. No, this Karma Yoga was for what they called the householder, the person who had a family, perhaps a farm, a job, a business, and what they weren't, as they would have seen it, ready or devoted enough to become a sannyasin, a celibate monk, and take to the real path, in which case they would then be given something higher. That's not at all what Dr. King meant by Karma Yoga. And even when you look at it, that you'll find in many of those writings, and I can't be dogmatic, there will be a tendency to say, well, what you do is you do the work you have to do, and you fulfill your obligations to your family and your duties, and then you detach from the fruits of the action. And this way, you will find enlightenment through that detachment, through that non-attachment. That's the old view of Karma Yoga. That's a million miles from the kind of service we're talking about, which is focused on how we can help this planet and the world and the humanity as potently as possible. You don't find that, actually. In my studies anyway, and there may well be exceptions, of Karma Yoga. So it's a very, very different thing indeed. And there's another point too, which is that there's a massive change afoot. Things have changed immensely. 1,000 years ago, we're told, you could gain enlightenment fully through a meditative path. Now you can't. Now even if you tried to, you wouldn't be able to gain full enlightenment through a primarily meditative path. You would have to serve now. And when you think about it, if you go back in history and you remove the opportunities which exist now, and I would say especially through King Yoga, then of course it's kind of understandable in a way, because it was probably accepted that to really make a big difference in the world in a spiritual way, you would need to be at least an adept. You would need to be advanced before you could really cooperate with the plan, with the ascended masters, before you'd even know how to. And if you went all the way and became an ascended master, which is men and women, by the way, ascended masters, then of course you could make a massive difference. In fact, our whole existence depends upon the ascended masters every second. Their presence here enables continuity of existence on this planet by humanity. And so you can see that in the past, it was understandable that people were encouraged to develop themselves to a high level before they really engage in active service. That's changed now. Today, you can go, as some of you did last week, to Mount Baldy, and if you're really fired up and really inspired, you can send out as much energy as did an adept of old. And that's just one thing. Today, you can come along here on Tuesday, and the same thing will be happening all over the world. Tune in to, you don't have to wait till Tuesday actually, but for example on Tuesday, to the last hour of the spiritual push, a especially powerful time in a spiritual push. And again, massive energies could go through you for the world. You can engage in missions, you can perform actions, or we can perform actions without being adepts. That's the point I'm making. And a lot of that has to do, I would say, with King Yoga. So because of that great change, then that is reflected in what is, as Brian said, a new yoga. And it wouldn't be right to describe it as just, for the reasons I've mentioned, just one yoga, because it includes several. And also, it wouldn't really be right to call it karma yoga in the sense that it's traditionally understood anyway, because it's about global service. And it all dovetails together. Now, one of the, as we go, we want to give some of the sort of unique keys that Dr. King gave to metaphysics. So he was a most unusual and extremely unique. Can you be extremely unique? You're either unique or you aren't. But master. And he had his own way and his own stamp on things. And he said, certainly to me, and I'm sure to others here, on more than one occasion, he said, in the end, he said, what I am is a logician. Logician, not magician. He was that too. And he was a strategist. But he applied his logic. It's not the kind of logic you need to have a PhD to understand, by the way. Because we have members of the Aetherius Society right across the board, and there's no reason to believe that someone who isn't particularly academic is always going to be less logical than someone who is. So it's not that. It's applied logic, and then manifesting it, and you can see it in the genius of those who are familiar with it, of something like Operation Sunbeam at its absolute peak. And he understood truth, and he understood the polarity of truth, because that's what a metaphysician can do. Any great truth, the opposite is also true. So if you say, I am divine, that's true. And if you say, I am a flawed human being with many failings, that's also true. And they contradict each other, but they're still both true. That's the metaphysical mind can see beyond, 1 and 1 is 2. You can go beyond that to 1 and 1 is 3 and 1 and 1 is 4. We can talk about that some other time, but it's a deeper kind of thinking. And in the same way, I think one of the great beauties of King Yoga is that what you get is two things. You get service and you get spiritual development. together. That's not an either or, because the more spiritually developed we are, the much, much more powerful will be our service to others. And in fact, you can do your development, say your breathing exercises or whatever you're choosing to do, your prayer, for that very reason. So as you sit down doing what would be traditionally regarded as self-development exercises, you're doing it so that you can serve more. There is no difference. There's not an either or. And obviously service is the priority. But it all works together. And by the same token, as you serve, so you become more advanced. You must do, because all of us, our consciousness will change as we are serving spiritually. So we will develop. They're not opposites. They are a yin and a yang, you could say, but they're also one and the same. And I think that's one of the great beauties of King Yoga. And finally, I want to make a very important point. There's a point that Dr. King made, and other masters and teachers have made. When you practice a path which is given to you by a teacher, you don't have to, by the way. I mean, I'm lucky, Brian's lucky, and several other people here are very lucky to have physically met Dr. King and known him very well. But you don't have to have met your teacher physically. As I said earlier, he's very much with us. He's very much here. His presence is very, very much among us, I believe. But you don't have to have physically met him to have that link. As a matter of fact, you could be a person who has never met him, but actually is closer to him than someone who has, because of what you do. And when you start to put into effect the teachings and practices of a particular master, say through King Yoga, you will draw to yourself higher knowledge and wisdom from that master. You will make a connection with that master. And I think it's very appropriate that we therefore have the right name, King Yoga. Some people have said, well, is this in commerce they might call it a rebranding exercise, you know? And is it a rebranding exercise? And it isn't really, because in a rebranding exercise, you'd probably sit down and think, well, what's going to be most commercially effective? What should we call it? We didn't have a choice. I think we're very lucky, myself, that his name was King. That's not by chance. If he'd been called Butterworth, no offence to people called Butterworth at all, I don't think it would be such a good name, Butterworth Yoga. Or Higginbottom Yoga. No disrespect, Master, here. But it wasn't, point I'm making, it's like some marketing exercise where we're sitting down, what's going to work here? This is his name. And it behoves us, I think. And it reminds us every time we do it of the source. But it also empowers that connection with this greatest, well, I'm biased, but a greatest of all masters, I believe. Among the greatest who've ever walked the earth, let me just put it that way. He didn't make statements like that very often. He could have done. And that connection is gold dust. And through practicing King Yoga, we're reminding ourselves all the time, are we not, just by the name of the source and the power of that source and the beauty of that source and the mind of that source. And we'll get into, make a connection with it. And as Dr. King said, the harder we work at the teachings and practices of that master, the more that will happen, and you'll draw to yourself at an intuitive level some of the higher wisdom of that master. That's a promise that he made. That's a reason for doing King Yoga, if nothing else. So those are some. One could talk at length about it. I was quite interested because I think I believe, it's my opinion, that this week is a very significant week. Indeed, in history, I'll go that far. Brian mentioned that this has been practiced. Well, I told you the book came out last year with that name on it, and then earlier this year the directors officially launched it, and there have been a number of meetings. Jude was among the first who held a King Yoga launch in Aba, in Nigeria. We have a wonderful branch there in eastern Nigeria, and it was launched there, I think, in February, Jude, wasn't it? Which is great. And then there's been things in Canada and here, of course, very much so. And there have been a number of events in New Zealand and so on. But this week, we had this event on Sunday in London, and today, for the first time, Brian and myself together here, I think is a very significant event. And I thought I'm going to look up and see a couple of big religions. We're not a big religion, but I think in terms of numbers, which isn't the main way to judge it, of course, but if you look back to, say, early Christianity, you'd find that it was just one of many Jewish sects before the resurrection, and for some time after it, actually, although it expanded beyond that. And I was looking to see when the name Christianity came into use first, and it's very hard to find out, actually, because Christianity is named after Jesus Christ. And it looks as though, historians believe, that it came into being 10 years after the resurrection in Antioch at a meeting held by St. Paul and St. Barnabas. St. Paul, who of course never physically met Jesus, took up the persona of Jesus and spread his name very widely across. And a lot of people don't know about him. And I don't know whether all the writings attributed to him are accurate at all, by the way, or whether some of that's come down through theologians and others with bias. I don't know. But what I was interested to see is that when St. Paul travelled around promoting Christianity, he had to work. Some of you would be interested to know that, because we tend to think, I wonder where he was drawing his salary. He was a tent maker. He had to sort of pitch up somewhere in hundreds of miles away from where he came from and start repairing people's tents. And then he'd go out and preach. It's an interesting little point I thought I'd throw in. But anyway, Christianity came in sometime after Jesus. And then I looked up Buddhism, and that's very hard to know when that term Buddhism came in. But it looks as though it did come in quite some time after Lord Buddha. While the Lord Buddha was walking the earth and teaching, his movement was referred to as Sangha, from what I can tell. I'm no expert, I don't claim to be, but the term Buddhism came in later. And I believe King Yoga will spread through this earth. And I believe it will be practiced. And it will stand the test of time beyond all doubt, because it is so fantastic. It contains so many jewels and gems of practice, of teaching, and of mission activity. It stands high, and it will be known throughout this earth. That's what I believe will happen to King Yoga. Thank you. So I think it'd be a good thing now if Brian and I, because we're going to start doing what I just said, which is putting into practice, and some of the things we're going to put into practice are things some of you will be familiar with, some of you won't, some of them quite basic, some not, but even the things that are so-called basic and very simple are actually extremely powerful, and even if you've done them before, you might get a whole new experience about it. When we did the event in London on Sunday, it seems very long ago, does it, Sunday? We had similar audience as we have here, and a lot of people, including some new people, were having fantastic experiences, because there's one thing about King Yoga and the Aetherius Society in general, it's not solely based on faith. I told you, Dr. King himself was a logician. You can apply your logic to it, for sure. You can also apply your intuition to it, even more for sure, I'd say. But you can also go by experience. You don't have to have a leap of faith. You can see these are things you can test and try out. And that's what we're going to do a bit now. And I'm going to ask Brian to join me on the platform. But before I do, I'm talking a bit, the focus today is about success, is it not? And finding real success. And Dr. King gave a rather wonderful, very wonderful lecture on this, how to be really successful. And I think nowadays, if you had a title like How to Be Really Successful, it could almost be How to Be Very Successful, is what it could mean now. And that isn't what Dr. King meant at all when he said really. Then when he delivered it, he meant how to be really successful, which isn't necessarily what some people think of as success. So rather than going into what success is, I think it'd be much better, I'm going to invite Alison to read to us a very well-worded article, actually, or part of an article that appeared in an early edition of Cosmic Voice. And it was about something that happened at the Bel Air Hotel. Do you know that at all, Jude? The Bel Air Hotel? You know it, okay. But he went there. I was setting the scene. Dr. King started the society in England, and I want to just share one little thing about that with you. He had a small group, a healing circle, which he'd had for a number of years before he was contacted by his master, the Master Aetherius, with the command in 1954. And it took him, I think, 3 weeks, I think I'm right in saying, 3 weeks, yeah, in order to become a channel for the Master Aetherius. And he started to receive communications from the Master Aetherius in his residence in Maida Vale, and sometimes in other people's residences, he would take these transmissions, as we call them. And then in January 1955, this was a master who was extremely confident, but also very shy. That's seems like a paradox, doesn't it? But he was. He was both those things, and those who knew him knew that. It's not that he doubted himself at all. He didn't. He knew. He knew what he was, and he knew what was true. There was no question about it, ever. But he wasn't a person who liked the platform. And in January 1955, you imagine the climate then, in England, in conservative England, if you know anything about that, was very, very, if you went to post a letter, you put a jacket and tie on in those days. And he went out to a hall in Westminster called Caxton Hall, public for the first time to actually receive a transmission in public from the Master Aetherius. And what I just want to tell you is that all the members of his little group that he had in a place called Maida Vale in London, not one of them supported him. They all left him, and he turned up there alone. It's the kind of master he was. But he did it, and he built the society up. And in 1959, he came to America penniless. He arrived here with a person called Keith Robertson, and very quickly met Lady Monique and Irene and others, Charles and Ellie, fairly soon after that. But this was very early on. This talk, from what we can understand, was given at the Bel Air Hotel on August the 11th of 1959, just after he'd arrived in America. And that would be 2 days after the charging of Mount Baldy, I believe. So it's very early on. That's the scene. And now I'm going to ask Alison to read this, as I say, very nicely worded, short piece by Keith Robertson about what happened at the Bel Air Hotel.
It was a warm, sunny, cloudless August afternoon in the most elite part of Hollywood, California. The place? The Bel Air Hotel on Sunset Boulevard, the playground of the smart people and the meeting place of who's who in society. Amidst the palm-decked, lush gardens of this, the most elegant of resorts, strolled exquisitely groomed ladies and gentlemen who were gradually making their way into one of the beautifully decorated reception rooms of this hotel, where there was to be a celebrity meeting. Such an occasion was quite common at the Bel Air Hotel, where celebrities are indeed specially catered for. The celebrity meeting at the Bel Air Hotel is a weekly function where everyone from film stars to literary barons came to entertain, expound pet theories, and perhaps even give morsels of information regarding their private lives. Indeed, the beautiful and unperturbed surroundings of the Bel Air Hotel is an ideal setting for such revelations of human mysteries. But on this particular afternoon, The celebrity was by way of being rather an unusual guest, for he had not come along to expound theories, but rather facts. As for giving morsels of gossip about his private life, he had no private life of which to speak. Here was a rare jewel among men, a man on a mission of truth. One by one, the guests sauntered through the archways and pavilions of the charming Spanish architecture, which was festooned with the most exotic of flowers, into the celebrity room. Finally, our celebrity rose, greeted his audience, and commenced to give them the Space People's message. Throughout the brilliant exposition that followed, truth after truth was laid bare before the audience. The facts of reincarnation, the truth about the horrors of the H-bomb, the impending catastrophe on this planet, the law of karma and its implications, and a reminder of the missions of such people as Krishna, Buddha, and Jesus. Quite often, nods of agreement could be seen coming from the audience. This, of course, was to be expected. Any reaction to the contrary would have been amiss, to say the least, amidst such peaceful and eloquent surroundings. Towards the end of the meeting, however, the charming hostess rose and, as was her custom on all such occasions, asked the most controversial of all questions. Mr. Celebrity, what, in your opinion, is success? To give you my opinion of what is success, answered the celebrity, without hesitation, it will be necessary to tell you all a little story. There was once a very rich and powerful king who, with his son, lived in a great palace. As was the custom in Eastern countries, where this story takes place, the king bestowed all manner of worldly goods and riches upon his son, the finest silks, the most valuable jewels, a stable of thoroughbred horses, even the most beautiful women chosen from all the lands thereabouts were given freely by the king to his son. Even so, the son took little or no interest in these worldly things, so that the king, whose great dream it was that his son should rule the land as he had done, built for him a golden palace, which was considered lavish even in those pompous days. The palace was well guarded, for the king forbade his son to travel, as was his wont, among the people. But one night the guards fell asleep, and the young man saddled his favourite horse and rode unnoticed from the palace into the night. For 10 years he sat in silence, sometimes so weakened by his sojourn he nearly died. But in some strange way, whenever starvation threatened to pluck the life force from his body, he was discovered by shepherds and cared for, even though they knew not who he was. It was some 10 years later when he returned again to the palace gates. He came back, not to the lavish wealth of a whole empire, but in the rags of a beggar, for he had turned away from what the world had to offer, but had discovered the everlasting jewel, wisdom. His fame spread throughout the world, not as a powerful king, as a great ruler, but as a wise man, and today, thousands of years later, men revere this name whenever it is mentioned. Who was this great being who had forsaken an empire to take up a begging bowl? No less a person than the Lord Buddha. That, ladies and gentlemen, is my opinion of the strange intangibility of that which constitutes success. At this closing remark, an agonizing hush fell over the audience as the vast implications of this simple story sank deeply home. Any security built upon the foundations of material success relished by some members of that audience was shattered. Dear readers, need I tell you that the celebrity on this occasion was George King? Indeed, this warm, drowsy, August afternoon had been an eye-opening occasion for the Bel Air celebrity gatherings.
Thank you, Alison. One of Dr. King's keys and one of his secrets that he said was to practice unconditional surrender to God. And if we try and find out the way that we can make the biggest difference, that is the way that will bring us the greatest, not that we do it for this reason, but in the end, the greatest happiness or spiritual satisfaction. It can be tough, it can be challenging, it will be if it's important. It has to be. But the other secret he gave, and I'll give you this exact quote, make everything in your life subservient to that one great thing that you want to be successful in. And sooner or later, by law, your opportunity will come. Even if you die in the meantime, then in the next life it will come to you. Success does not come to the wishers, it comes to the doers. That's a great quote there by Dr. King. And Dr. King said this: what is important is pushing on with the mission. And I have been asked by the Cosmic Masters to perform a specific mission. I have promised to do it, and I will do it. I will do it even after my demise. It will not stop that. And there is a reason to be doing King Yoga. God bless you all.